Welcome back to Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders, the podcast that exists to equip you in the counseling-related needs of your ministry and to encourage you in the hard work of ministry. My name is Jess Hayes, and I'm the director at iHope Christian Care and Counseling, a small nonprofit Christian counseling center in South Carolina. I'm a licensed counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a supervisor candidate with the state, and we are going to talk today about a topic that comes up very frequently in the counseling world. And it definitely comes up frequently in your own church or ministry context, but you might not always be aware of it. And that is the topic of trauma. Today, I just want to open our eyes a little bit and offer a little bit of information about how to help people who have a trauma background or maybe are going through something really difficult right now. And it might not be necessarily always the type of trauma you're thinking of. It might be really heavy emotional baggage from some very serious hurts in their past. And you may or may not always know the details. You may or may not even know that something specific has happened. But many times we interact with people and we can see the hurt and the pain that they are carrying. And that is exactly the moment when we need God the most. So today, here on Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders, I'm going to share a few do's and don'ts for how to come alongside and help people who are struggling with trauma or just heavy emotional baggage. I'm going to share 5 do's and 5 don'ts. And as I already mentioned, myself, I am a licensed counselor. And I don't always say this here on the podcast, although it's written in the description and all of that. But I'll just remind you that this podcast is not offering specific professional advice to your situation, to a specific counseling dynamic that you might be working through. There are always going to be nuances and details that might change the direction of your counsel or feedback or prayer support or whatever it is that you are offering a unique individual person. I hope that's clear, but we live in a world where it's always worth specifically saying the things that we think need to be clear. So before we jump into these 5 do's and don'ts, I would just remind you, especially if you are in the state of South Carolina, that you can learn more about the iHope Center at ihopeflorence.com. We are the sponsor for this podcast, and here in the state we offer professional counseling. We also offer life coaching virtually and in person. And I will remind you, if you're in the state, that we are a 501c3 and we welcome your donations because they support this ministry. They support the cost and the time for things like this podcast. So I'm glad that you are here. I'll give one other little, admin type of note before we jump into these 5 do's and don'ts. And that is to encourage you to leave a review for the Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders podcast. If you're there on Apple Podcasts, that's the most popular app is what the stats tell me. And you can just open up the show, scroll about halfway down. You'll see that little hyperlink that says write a review. It's so easy. It's so quick. And it's a great encouragement for us. You can maybe let us know some topics you'd like for us to cover. And it really helps the show to grow and to reach more and more pastors and ministry leaders. And maybe you're not a review type of person, or maybe this is just more of a fit for your personality. You can also, in the little drop down thing there, wherever you're listening to, or there on YouTube, it's much easier if you're watching this, you can also copy the link for this episode and just text it to a friend, email it to a colleague. If you know someone who might be struggling with one of the specific topics that we talk through here on the show. But let's jump in to this conversation. So before we go through 5 do's and 5 don'ts, it's worth defining for a moment what I mean when I say trauma. Now, I already mentioned that you don't have to know all the ins and outs, all the details of what happened for you to often recognize someone is struggling. But for our purposes here, when I talk about trauma, it's really just a situation that feels completely overwhelming, scary, and life-threatening. Now, classic trauma would include things like being in combat, in war, a very serious car accident, being the victim of a violent crime, where your life is threatened and it's completely overwhelming, and there's often a sense of helplessness. But plenty of people experience very heavy emotional baggage and might consider it trauma. It's not like there's a technical definition where you have to be able to check a box before these tips would be helpful. But if you've been the victim of an affair, that your marriage ended due to infidelity, if you've gone through a cancer scare and a very serious life-threatening illness, there are all sorts of situations that people face in this broken world that are traumatic and life-changing for them. So let's start with 5 do's that everyone can benefit from and help us as we come alongside to help people with trauma or other just heavy emotional experiences. Do number 1, please, please, please expect miracles. Do not put limitations on what you think God can do. We serve a big God, and He is good, and His plans to restore and redeem and heal and comfort are far beyond anything we can understand. And the person that you're helping might not be at a place to recognize that, agree with that, rest in that, but you can. So do number 1 is to expect miracles because we serve a big and great God. Number 2 is that you should, this is the do category, do show the love of Christ to people who are hurting. And that, of course, includes truth and love. We see so many examples in the Gospels of Jesus reaching out and physically touching lepers, of Jesus bringing people back from the dead, of Jesus feeding people in incredible, miraculous ways. You don't have to be able to perform a miracle to show a hurting person the love of Christ. Speak truth to them, speak encouragement to them, sit with them, cry with them, hug them if that's appropriate in your context. Show them the truth and the love and the care that Jesus offers. Number 3 on our do list is to suggest and then encourage and follow up on coping skills for them. It's very easy if you are stuck in a place where you're recovering from trauma, there's something very heavy in your life, to get kind of stuck. And sometimes even to buy into a little bit of a very negative victim type of thinking. You might start to feel totally helpless in every area of life, or start being paranoid, thinking everyone's out to get me. Those are pretty normal trauma reactions. And you can suggest things that they can do or think about, maybe suggesting some exercise techniques or emotional coping techniques like journaling or praying or art. Actually, just last week on the podcast, we had 10 different categories of coping skills. So you could go back and listen to that. It might give you some ideas. But offering specific ideas and trying, if you can, to come alongside them, to encourage them in that, help them in that, maybe do it with them to get the ball rolling. That can be so helpful to kind of move people through the hurt and the pain that they might be stuck in. Number 4 here is to come alongside them with relationship. It's not often about something we do to recover from trauma and from pain, but often it is relationship dynamics, someone being present with us, listening to us, offering kindness and showing that they are trustworthy and they are patient, because the process is not quick and it is not easy. We see this, I think, most commonly in the Bible in the book of Job. And we can maybe give a bad rap to Job's friends. Of course, God, eventually comes out and points out many of the theological mistakes that they're making in the words they're offering Job. But the first thing they did is their friend was hurting and they came and they sat with him and they mourned with him. Then they started talking. But there obviously are wonderful truths and things that you can share with people, but simply being present with people when they are hurting is so meaningful. And number 5 on this do list of ways that you can help people who are struggling from responding to a trauma is to label and validate emotions. Knowing that those emotions are probably very hard, very dark, very deep. You might be labeling emotions like anger, fear, panic, bitterness. And I don't mean label as far as like pointing the finger and, well, I can't believe you're feeling X, or telling people what they're feeling. But when you see them crying or struggling, or you hear them wrestling through something and an emotion word comes to mind, it can be helpful to add that into the conversation. It can help to normalize their experience, that they are not weird for feeling big, hard emotions when they have been through a trauma. And you don't have to validate and agree with every behavior that they might be showing, but the emotions are real. We can't pretend that they're not, and they are a part of the healing process. And so putting words to those emotions and not rejecting them or pushing them away because they're feeling really angry, or they're incredibly upset, or they can't stop crying, they're just so sad, they're so hopeless. Stepping into that pain with them is a wonderful way to help. It's not going to miraculously solve the problem, but it is a part of loving them in the name of Christ. But let's also talk about 5 don'ts. Don'ts. And again, this is my encouragement from a counseling perspective. There might be times where versions of this make sense, but I can't think of any right now myself. But these are 5 don'ts that I would really encourage you to avoid as you are walking alongside someone who is healing from trauma. So don't, never, ever, ever. Do not blame them for what happened. Even in a roundabout way, it is often true that people make mistakes, people make bad choices, and then bad things can happen from that. That does not mean they are responsible for someone else doing a bad thing to them or to someone that they love. And it's safe to assume if someone has been through a trauma, they're probably blaming themselves. They're thinking a lot of negative thoughts. And so we need to be careful as we maybe get to a point where we can talk through different decisions that could have been made. We are not blaming this person. We are loving them. We are caring for them. We're trying to encourage them in a better future. Blame is not helpful in that recovery process. Number 2 here would be, it's very helpful to avoid bashing the perpetrator, whoever it is that hurt them. Eventually, they're going to need to work through the process of forgiveness, even if that is 100% between them and the Lord, and they don't have that interaction with the other person. Forgiveness is the call on a Christian's life. And if we are blaming and negative and bashing the perpetrator, whoever it is that hurt them, we are not supporting that forgiveness process. Being careful with our language is so helpful. Number 3 here, things to avoid. Don't. This is the don't list for helping people with trauma, is to tell other people what they're struggling with. You might call this gossip, and the Lord is very clear we should not do it. But it's easy sometimes to assume more people know what's going on, or to talk about a prayer request and share more details than is helpful. And trauma is often so personal, so shameful, so difficult to process. We need to be careful that we are not accidentally, or maybe on purpose, telling other people what someone might be struggling with. Number 4 here, don't make them feel weird. Okay? Trauma is awkward to talk about, and it's easy to try to lean back from that very sensitive topic, very emotional conversation. But if you're avoiding eye contact, if you're crying every time you see them, if you're avoiding certain words, which you probably do with your eyes getting a little bit big, you're not saying that certain person's name, or you're talking in hushed tones with them all the time, or you're just staring at them across the room because you're thinking and praying about them. You might be intending something very good, but you might be making them feel very awkward and weird. Don't do it. Come alongside them with genuine conversation, make eye contact, pat them on the shoulder, have a real interaction with them, even if the topic is sensitive or difficult or embarrassing or just not fun to talk about. We know that's going to be a part of it because you're dealing with trauma. And number 5 here on the don't list is, please do not force the issue about if they do or do not talk about what happened, if they do or do not give you details on what happened. There will be times where they want to talk about it, they need to talk about it, and there will be times where they don't. You are not the one who gets to decide when would that be good or helpful or healthy. And pushing the conversation, often at the end of the day, it comes back to making us feel better. I want to be able to move on. And so I'd like to just talk about it, get it out there, and then let's go. Let's move on to a new conversation. That is not helpful for the grief process or the recovery process. So let me recap these 5 do's and don'ts for helping people with trauma or heavy emotional issues that they are working through. Do expect miracles from our great God. Do show them the love of Christ with truth and care. Do suggest specific ideas for coping skills they could try. Do come alongside them with relationship and with your presence. And do label and name the emotions that are coming up and validate them. Don't push them away. You don't have to accept, again, all the behaviors. If they're screaming because they're angry, deal with the screaming. But the anger might make sense, or there's something underneath it that makes sense. And 5 don'ts. Don't blame them for what happened. Don't bash the perpetrator that the Lord is calling on them to forgive. That's a process. It's not easy, but it is a part of the Lord's call. Don't tell other people what they are struggling with. Don't make them feel weird by avoiding them or just acting awkward around them. And don't force the issue, trying to make them talk about certain things or share certain things with certain people. That needs to be their story to tell, and to decide when and how and if to tell it. So I hope, friends, that some of these ideas are helpful. And again, if you are in South Carolina and you are curious about counseling services with iHope, you can head to ihopeflorence.com, and you can also make a donation there to support us. We are a 501c3, a distinctly Christian counseling center in Florence, South Carolina. So I will sign off for now. We will be back next week with more counseling tips for pastors and ministry leaders.